Good. Let's go.
Okay, shall we start?
Let's
Do it.
Okay. Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. Hello to everyone. Our first session last Sunday went very well. My name is Jeff Gingold, and Rabbi Myra Seufer and I will be your hosts for today and next week. Our first session last Sunday went very well. We received excellent feedback and suggestions from several people. The recording of last week's program is available. It's on YouTube. You go to Jews and Race, Sinai, Reno, and you can watch it. We lost the first about 10 minutes, but after that, it's fine. We're recording, and I turned on this week's. We'll be recording this week and next week's session, and they'll be available as well. Most important, people want to continue this discussion now and in the future, and they want to work on our goals of improving the welcome and feelings of inclusion at Sinai. This week, thanks to some of the suggestions, we're going to change the format a bit. I just muted everybody for the formal talk. During this time, if you would like, you can enter comments or questions in the chat box. When the question and answer session begins, people will be able to present comments and questions out loud if they want to do so. And I'll remind you at that what to do, but if you look at the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says reactions, if you hit reactions, there's a sign that says raise hand. And if you raise hand, the little hand that's over there comes up. So you'll be able to see that. And I'll remind people about that. Rabbi Myra will select the folks and they can unmute themselves then so they can speak to us all. Let's see. And then after the reactions, then you lower your hand and the little sign goes away. So that's good. Jane Grossman is going to put a link in the chat box to a wonderful video on racial justice. It is an interview that Nevada Humanities had with Isabel Wilkerson, who is the author of the 2020 Pulitzer Prize winning nonfiction book, Caste. It's about 49 minutes. It will only be available through March 18th. I listened to it today. It's quite terrific. 20 years ago, I was in a business meeting with the administrator of a healthcare company I worked with. We were discussing buying some new equipment. It'll be very expensive, I said. Don't worry, she said. We'll Jew them down. I froze, wondering how someone I so respected could make such a horrible comment, especially in front of me. That's a horrible thing to say, I replied. Oh no, she said. It's a common thing that people say all the time. It has been 20 years and I still recall that moment. Today's speaker, Dr. Nicole Jacobs, will speak about microaggressions of this type. Dr. Jacobs is the Associate Dean of Diversity and Inclusion and Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at UNR School of Medicine. She is co-director of the Practice of Medicine block, which is a hands-on clinical skills course for first-year medical students to get them aware of these issues right from the start. She is also, she helps to teach the behavioral science and diversity curriculum at UNR Med. She did her undergraduate at University of Seattle and University of Washington in Seattle, got a master's and then a PhD in psychology at UNR. She then did a residency program at the VA Sierra Nevada Medical Center in Reno. Outside of work, she loves spending time with her family, traveling, cooking, and baking. She has been in Reno since 1994. She and her husband have 2 teenage sons. Welcome, Dr. Jacobs.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gingold, and thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the wonderful and warm welcome. It's lovely to see all of your faces on a Sunday afternoon. I really respect that your temple is putting on these series and wanting to educate yourselves and learn how to identify when microaggressions occur. And so hopefully today you will learn more about what microaggressions are. We'll talk about some examples, and that'll be in the first half hour, and in the last half hour, hopefully apply them. I hope that that's a very interactive part of our conversation to a case that I have developed. In preparation for this, I watched a couple of videos, and I spoke with Dr. Gingold and also Myra Soifer just to try to get a little bit of a sense of what some of the issues might be that are a little bit more relevant for your community. So hopefully this will feel like it's relevant to you. Please do ask questions either in the chat. I will keep an eye on it, or just go ahead and raise your hand or unmute. I don't really plan on having an exact Q&A session. The first half will be me kind of letting you know what some of the basics are. The last half will be a lot more interactive. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we can get started here. All right, can everyone see my screen okay? Okay, excellent. So as I said, we are going to be talking about microaggressions in general, and then specifically in the Jewish community. And what I hope to do is provide you with a set of skills, which we call kind of a toolkit, for when you're in the presence of one of these microaggressions occurring, whether you are a recipient, whether you are the source, sometimes we are the ones that are saying them, or if you are a bystander. So Dr. Gingold and Myra Soifer let me know that there are over 30 times in the Torah where it is mentioned quotes regarding whether, welcoming the stranger because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And there's one out of Exodus specifically that says, do not mistreat or oppress the stranger, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And the idea here is that all of us can draw upon our own experiences of having someone treat us or mistreat us or treat us badly, and hopefully use that to develop empathy for others. And that's what I hope you do today as we talk. So some of you might have heard the term microaggressions, but just so we're all on the same page, they are subtle statements or behaviors that unconsciously communicate a message that's typically pretty negative or denigrating to people that identify with certain social groups. And there are 3 different types of microaggressions: micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. But really what's important for you to be aware of and to understand is that these are messages that are often intended actually to be compliments, yet they come off in a hurtful way because of the association or the history that they have. So let me talk with you a little bit about some examples of these. So there are different types of microaggressions. One of them is the type that's the sense of being an alien in your own land. And so people will often ask somebody that doesn't typically look American, whatever that means, where are you from, right? So they might ask an Asian American person or a Latinx person that's actually been in this country maybe for generations, where are you from? And then they say, I'm from wherever Sparks. And then they say, no, where are you really from? And again, that's not necessarily meant to be hurtful, but the message underneath that is that you are an alien in your own land. You can't possibly be American because you don't look American. The same thing of telling someone that they speak good English. Again, they may have been in this country all of their lives, or maybe even for multiple generations. So being surprised that someone speaks English well, just because they don't, kind of look American, it can come off as a microaggression. There are also microaggressions related to ascriptions of intelligence. And unfortunately, I see this a lot in my role, being one of the block directors, when some medical students are surprised that other medical students actually really got an A on the exam. And they typically are surprised when students of color do really, really well on an exam. And so it's just this sense of not associating intelligence with being, a darker shade. And that is definitely a microaggression. Another one is around color blindness. And again, I think that this is often intended as a compliment. When I look at you, I don't see color. And then that just kind of makes me wonder, like, is there something wrong with your eyes, or are you colorblind or something? Or saying something like America is a melting pot, which, I think these are lovely ideas, but the reality of that is that when you're a melting pot, you have to lose your own individuality, and you have to take on and sort of melt into everything else. You have to assimilate or acculturate. And so that's how that can come off as a microaggression. Another one is around connections with criminality. And so you hear often, you might have even heard from a friend of yours who might be a person of color, that they were followed in a store, or that they get pulled over more frequently by the police, or if you're in an elevator and then a Black person walks in, and you sort of just clutch your purse a little bit more tightly. And this is very unfortunate, because I know physicians who are, very, very high level. They might even be, chairs in a department or high level deans. And even though they are very, very intelligent and very accomplished, they still get pulled over many, many times by the police in this town, for example, and elsewhere. The next one is around denial of individual racism, saying something like, well, I can't be racist because I have, Black friends, or I have Asian friends, I have friends. And this is a microaggression, because really what it does is it robs you of the opportunity to learn. All of us have bias. All of us have implicit bias. We may not want to have it, but we live in a world where there are a lot of associations, all of these things that you see in this left column. And so when you deny that you might have some of that bias, that can come off as a microaggression. The next one is around this myth of meritocracy. And I think this is kind of part of America, right? That everyone can work hard and be successful. And unfortunately, this is a microaggression, because there are a lot of people in this country who work very, very hard. They might have several jobs, and they still can't do well. There are ceilings, there are barriers that they have to deal with that other groups of people don't have to deal with. And so hearing that, obviously, if you're not successful, it means that you're just not working hard enough, can be very, very invalidating, particularly for people who are working hard. The next one is around the myth of diversity. And I see this a lot, unfortunately, in academia as well. This idea that somehow, in order to get more diversity, we had to somehow lower our standards. So, we lowered our GPA requirements or MCAT requirements or something like that in order to admit students of color, or somebody gets hired because they were the quote diversity hire or the affirmative action hire. And this is very hurtful, because I see that these medical students are just as smart and they work just as hard as anybody else to get there. And they hope that by the time they get to medical school or residency or in a job, that they don't have to deal with this type of bias anymore. And so it really comes off as a microaggression. And I'll tell you, in being in hiring and also being in admissions, we never ever lower our standards below any kind of minimum threshold. The next one is around pathologizing culture. There are certain cultures stereotypically that might be a little more loud or a little bit more quiet. And the problem is when we pathologize that. So saying something like, you shouldn't be so loud, or you shouldn't be so quiet, or how come you never talk in class? Women being judged as being emotional, or that sense of assertive versus aggressive, right? Whereas that same behavior might be seen as assertive for a man, but it's seen as aggressive for a woman. The next one is around this issue of second-class citizens. And we see this in medicine, but it's really kind of all over the place. Assuming that if there's a person of color, say in a medical school social event, that they must be the bus driver, or they must be, the janitor, Or if there is a woman in a scientific laboratory, that she must be the secretary, that she couldn't possibly be, the principal investigator but she must be the secretary. And finally, it can not even necessarily be something that somebody says or does, but just the environment itself can be a microaggression. So if there are no statues or pictures of people of color in the halls or on the walls, or in magazines or newsletters, that gives you a message, right? That's a microaggression right there in and of itself. So again, I spoke with Dr. Gingold and Myra Seufer, and we talked a little bit about some microaggressions that might be seen in our own community. Last week, Jason Harris and Sean Sawyer talked about this concept of this is hard for me to say, but Ashkenaz normativity, right? That this idea that Jews must be Ashkenazi Jews, that they look a certain way, and that is the norm. And he talked about it with respect to holiday celebrations and foods. And I thought that was a really fascinating conversation. But anything outside of that would be seen as different or not normal. Another one is thinking or saying that you can't possibly be racist because you have experienced anti-Semitism. And I wish it was the case that people who have experienced bias were somehow, inoculated or somehow immune from becoming, having that bias themselves. And unfortunately, it doesn't work that way. Another one, giving your drink order to a Latino congregate at a bar mitzvah. Just sort of assuming that they must not be, Jewish, that they must be the waiter or something like that. Confusing two Black congregates for one another, even though they may look very, very different, but calling them by one another's names, confusing them from one another, not kind of having that individuality and having that respect to understand and know their individual names. We see this a lot with our medical students as well, oftentimes that they'll get confused for one another. Saying to somebody, a person of color, you are so articulate, or you are a credit to your race. Again, this is probably meant in a very kind and lovely way, as a compliment, possibly even. But the message is that, well, I'm surprised that you're articulate, right? That I didn't think that you would be so articulate. So that can be sometimes seen as a microaggression, or you're a credit to your race. Obviously, I think that one's a little bit more obvious. You're not like the others. You're somehow special and different. Touching the hair of a Black female congregate without permission. That is something that there's a lot of sensitivity around. There's a lot of history around that, around Black bodies being mistreated or abused. And so it's definitely seen as a microaggression, even if it's meant like, oh, your hair is so beautiful, and reaching out and touching it without permission. We also see gender microaggressions as well. For example, expecting females to set up and clean up after a potluck, or expecting the female in the room to be the secretary or the one to take notes, from that meeting. There's also just the whole concept of the Jewish race that I think can be seen as a microaggression, because again, if it's a race, then there's certain kind of genetic features of somebody, and if you don't have those, then that can be a microaggression. Angela Buchdahl has a wonderful video that you can just Google and access, and she goes over quite a few microaggressions in that video. And I was wondering, obviously this isn't an exhaustive list. Are there other microaggressions that you have seen locally? And just go ahead and unmute and let me know. Any that you've experienced or you've been a witness to?
So I was going to say that the obvious one that happens a lot is somebody walks into a worship service and they don't fit the look of the Ashkenaz normativity look.
Mm-hmm.
And so everybody starts, explaining to them that the prayer book opens from the opposite direction. And do you know Hebrew? And I'll put you with someone and they could have been going to worship all themselves.
Yeah. Which is probably meant to be a very welcoming thing to do, right?
Right. And I think there's 4 people with raised hands, and I don't know how to see who they are.
I see Jane and Sue. Jane, do you want to go first? And then Talia? or Talia. Sorry if I'm saying that wrong.
And I think
Jane?
Jill.
You just have to unmute. Jane,
Okay, there we go.
there
Oh,
you
we-
go.
Can you hear me? So I had a situation where we were scheduling some pretty important events, political events last fall, and the key organizer wanted to have the event on Yom Kippur.
Mm,
And I said to her, well, that's a pretty important holiday. It's Yom Kippur, and I think we really should pick a different day. And she said, well, it's not my holiday, and the candidate isn't Jewish, so does it really matter? And I just looked at her and I said, well, let me just ask you one question. Would you schedule this on Christmas?
exactly.
And she said, no. I said, then there's your answer.
Well done. Thank you for that example. Sue? Just unmute.
Unmute me. Oh, there we go. Yeah, I think this is very interesting. I'm from Boston. I'm Jay Goldberg's mother. And I'm in Florida right now. But you mentioned Dr. Gingles when you talked about him, and you called her Myra. You did not call her Rabbi Myra.
Forgive
And you
me. Good catch.
just unconscious bias.
It is. And I think for me, I just have to admit, I am not Jewish. And I thank you for bringing that to my attention. And I am sorry, Rabbi Myra,
No
wherever you
problem.
are.
I'm here and it's fine. But I noticed it too.
So Sue just gave you a great example of being an active bystander. And she did it in a very kind, not offensive way. So thank you. All right. I see Talia's hand up, and then Jill, and then we'll move on.
Assuming that the Latino congregants are the landscapers is one that has happened in our community.
Thank you for that. And Jill? Can you unmute?
Sorry, two things. One would be age and the assessment that age may imply inability, but at the same time being respectful to physical inability. And the second is the sense of the norm, where I've been looked askance when I say good Shabbos, because that's Yiddish versus Shabbat Shalom.
Interesting. Thank you for those examples. Okay, and I have one more page of just a couple more here. What message do microaggressions give to Jews of color? It gives the message that you're a stranger or you don't belong here. You're not one of us. Any other messages that you feel that these types of microaggressions give? And you can either just unmute and talk or raise your hand. Jackie Ramirez.
For me, I had the experience of someone telling me that I couldn't be Jewish because of my last name, and so it made me feel like I needed to change and adopt my mom's last name, which is more Ashkenazi, which thankfully I didn't do that, and I still have my name, but it very much was like a feeling like I needed to change to blend in.
Interesting. So that was not even necessarily implicit, it was very explicit. You were explicitly told that you couldn't be Jewish with that last name. And it gave you the message that you have to change in order to fit in. Thank you for sharing that.
You're welcome.
Geralda?
Yes, hi.
Hi.
The assumption that you have to be married to someone Jewish to be, there participating, that you can't be there by choice, by your own choice, especially if you're female. You have to have married someone Jewish to be Jewish. So.
Interesting. or that you would only convert maybe because you were
Right.
married. Is that, yeah.
Yeah.
And I remember last week, a few examples of racism were shared by Sean. He talked about people questioning his conversion at a group, whereas they weren't questioning somebody else, like they were questioning whether his was legitimate, and then also being stopped by security or having his bags searched. Whereas other people that didn't look like him didn't have to deal with that. And I'm certain that this is not the types of messages that you want to give. And I think that the tricky thing with microaggressions is that they're not necessarily intentional. Some of the comments and examples that you guys shared were more explicit bias. Microaggressions typically come from bias that we don't even know we have. And that's kind of where it gets tricky. Because even though we might mean it well or mean it as a compliment, it unfortunately gives this message, and that message is very alienating and isolating. And I'm sure that that's not the message. So let's also talk a little bit. I don't want anybody to get the wrong idea. Sometimes people think that calling it microaggressions has something to do with it not having very much impact. And that's really not the idea at all, because in fact, there can be enormous emotional impact from even just a single microaggression. The reason it's called micro is really because it refers to the common daily experience. And that's why I think it can be particularly powerful, is because these are comments that get said over and over and over and over and over again. It's like that death by 1,000 paper cuts, right? And back when the term was coined in the 1970s by Chester Pierce, he differentiated microaggressions from macroaggressions because those were more like the physical violence, like lynchings, things like that. So I just don't want anybody to confuse micro for impact. Microaggressions are not always consciously done, and they are powerful because they are subtle. Sometimes they are invisible, especially to those who don't share the identity. And they can be said in a room full of people, and the person who hears it notices that they feel hurt, but they look around and nobody else is saying anything. And that can be very problematic and further alienating. And it also, these microaggressions can cause the recipient to experience very strong emotions because they oftentimes are hearing this and they can be very shocked and wondering, did that just happen? Am I being too sensitive? What did that person mean? How do I respond? Should I respond? And then sometimes if they don't respond, they can be really upset and angry with themselves afterwards. And that can impact our sense of self-esteem or self-worth. Or sometimes if there is a response, it can come off with a lot of anger because again, oftentimes you're not responding just to this one time that this person said this, you're responding to the whole chain of other times that people have said this type of microaggression to you. And so oftentimes it can get worse. There's also a health impact of microaggressions. We know from some very interesting literature that there's all kinds of mental health effects, things like depression and anxiety. We know in undergraduate college students, there can be alcohol use disorders and issues. We also know that it can contribute towards physical health problems because all this stress sort of adds up and we create this allostatic load and then there's inflammation and that's tied to all kinds of other health problems. And then for healthcare, this is particularly problematic because it causes a lack of trust in the healthcare system. And so we have people that don't want to go seek care. They either delay or they forego care altogether. And I think in your community, one of the results is that people can feel alienated. They may not feel welcome. They may not want to come to events. And that might really get in their way of their relationship with the community. There's also social and cognitive impacts of microaggressions. Does anyone know who this is a picture of?
That's Mara.
That's Mara Gad, right?
Mara
And
Gad,
she has
yeah.
a fantastic video, several videos. You can just YouTube it or Google it and watch. The social and cognitive impact of microaggressions is that they perpetuate stereotypes and they passively allow society to continue to devalue certain groups of people. And what happens for the recipient is that it causes energy to be diverted away from other important activities that they are hopefully engaged in, whether it be learning in an academic environment, spirituality or connection in a religious community. And then there may be other religious and spiritual impacts as well. So they're definitely problematic. So now that you know what microaggressions are, I want to introduce to you what we call the microaggression triangle. And this is how to respond when you are in the presence of one of these. And these are mnemonics, right? So the action mnemonic for the recipient, the bystander has the arise mnemonic, and then the source has the assist mnemonic. So we're going to talk about each of these, and then hopefully we will apply them to an example. So if you are the recipient, you can use this action mnemonic to try to get through the situation. So this model, this triangle model it's really what I want to make sure you understand that is that it's based on situations where people don't really intend to be hurtful, or they don't know that they're being hurtful. There are other examples where people are, especially in the last several years, where there's been a lot of explicit racism or sexism or all different kinds of isms. And this example, these models are not for those types of situations. So the idea here is that it's assuming that the person doesn't really know, they didn't intend to make a mistake, and that we want to use these as opportunities to create community, to try to bring people in and educate them, and to do it in a way that is empathetic and humanistic and allows for people to rebuild relationships and restore their reputations. And so rather than just jumping down someone's throat, right, which is sometimes very tempting, if you are the recipient, the idea here is to instead ask clarifying questions. So what did you mean by that? And the idea is to come from curiosity rather than judgment, because that is what will be more amenable to building that community and sort of calling that rather than calling them out. The T is for telling what you observed in a factual manner. So I noticed that when you did this, you said this to me, but I noticed that when you referred to the speakers, you said doctor for Dr. Gingold, and you didn't use rabbi for Rabbi Soifer, right? So that was a perfect example. Very factual, right? Not judgmental. The I is for impact exploration. So oftentimes when the recipient gets called on this, they say, oh, well, I didn't mean that. That wasn't what I intended. They get kind of defensive, and sometimes that can be dismissive to the person who's the recipient. So the idea here is to focus on the impact, whether or not it was your intent. So the impact is that it belittles or somehow kind of brings down the person who's the recipient. And so owning that impact, even if it wasn't your intent, and focusing on that impact over the intent is really, really important. The O is for owning your own thoughts and feelings and, being aware of what they are and sharing them if you feel comfortable doing that. And then the N is for talking about next steps. So again, hopefully we create a situation when we call somebody in where we can have continued learning. And so the N is for, let's talk a little bit more about this tomorrow. Or, hey, there's this great book or there's this great video if you want to learn more about this. We can watch it together, or you can watch it and then we can follow up and talk more about it afterwards. There's a few caveats with when you're the recipient. It's important to understand that oftentimes when you're the one that's being mistreated, especially if you're in any type of one down position, maybe you are an employee and the person who said it is the employer, or maybe you're a student and the person who said it is a professor. It creates this nearly impossible situation, and you have to consider a lot of factors before you decide how to respond. You have to be careful not to respond in a way that makes the situation worse, or even makes you seem like the aggressor. You might have perfectly justified anger or something, but I've seen situations where that anger actually ends up making the person who's the recipient look like the aggressor, and then it takes the attention off of the person who was the source in the first place. And so we want to be really careful to avoid that. The recipient also needs to consider whether they are safe. Are they safe physically? Are they safe emotionally in terms of their status? And they have to consider that before they decide whether or not to respond. And if they decide to respond, how are you going to respond? Sometimes they may also decide to address the issue at a later time and not necessarily in the moment. They may pull the person aside, let them know, or wait a little bit of time until, emotions kind of calm. They might want to seek the wise counsel of a trusted friend or mentor, come up with an informed plan, because again, remember that there are a lot of emotions for the person who's the recipient. And sometimes being able to respond in that moment when you are, kind of emotionally dysregulated may not be a very easy thing to do. But you can also address it in the moment, but check your motivations. I've seen situations, and I've been in these situations, unfortunately, where sometimes you just want to kind of like zing that person or humiliate them or make them look bad. And that is not really consistent with the philosophy of this model, which is to create that community and to create kind of these teachable moments. And finally, reporting the incident to the community, to somebody that's kind of higher up in some way, especially if it's happening, or if you're in a work environment, that may also be something that might be the right thing to do. So now I'm going to turn my attention and talk about if you are the source. So if you're the one that accidentally said something that you didn't mean, and somebody maybe brings it to your attention, you can use the assist model. So the first thing to do is to acknowledge your bias. So again, it's you want to be defensive, you want to explain yourself, you want to explain, why you didn't mean it, or how it wasn't your intention. But in any case, the impact was there. And so acknowledging your bias is a great way to start. Seeking feedback and information, how can I learn more about this? Thank you for bringing that to my attention. And then saying you're sorry. If somebody had the courage to bring this to your attention, they gave you a gift. They respected you enough, and they felt like they had enough relationship with you, and they cared about you enough to bring this to your attention. And so saying that you're sorry and saying thank you is really, really important. And then the I is for that same impact. A few caveats. First, it's really important to avoid becoming defensive. It's super tempting. And again, just be aware that we all have a confirmation bias, and we all have this commitment confirmation. Nobody wants to think that they're biased. And oftentimes people go to this kind of all or nothing place where if somebody calls it to your attention, you think that they're telling you that you're a bad person. And that's not what this is about. There are all kinds of really wonderful people, including me, who put my foot in my mouth at the very beginning of this, right? And thank goodness somebody brought that to my attention, and hopefully I owned it, right? So all of us have biases that we don't even know we have. All right, finally, when you are the bystander, this means that you are somebody who maybe you overheard or you were in the presence of something. How can you use the arise approach? So obviously, first you have to be aware of it. You have to know that it happened. And so hopefully that what I talked about at the very beginning of this will help you get to that space. And then the R is for responding with empathy. So again, we may want to be judgmental, or we may want to jump down, somebody's throat, or call them names, or whatever the case is, but responding in a way that that empathizes, because all of us have been in the situation where we're the source, right? And so kind of remembering that we've all made mistakes, we all have bias that we don't know we have, and responding with that empathy can be really important. And the I here stands for inquiry of facts. What did you mean? Help me understand. Help me understand your comment or your thinking. And then the S is for using I statements that start with I. I noticed this. I heard you say this, and you said it to this person, but not that person. Perfect example earlier. And then the final E does double duty for both educating and engaging. Use it as an opportunity to teach the person, because they probably made the mistake because they didn't know any differently, and then try to engage that person. Again, we want to call people in to build that community, to create these teachable moments, not call them out and make them feel shameful or defensive. And finally, just a few caveats for the bystander. Even if you're the bystander and not necessarily the recipient, you still have to assess the situation. You have to decide whether to respond and how to respond. Consider the safety of all individuals. Is this the right time and place? What would be the best strategy? How can I do this? Or can I do it in a way that preserves the dignity of the individuals and the relationships? And so considering all those things before you decide whether to respond and how to respond. And then also, can you do it in a way that allows for rebuilding? Oftentimes there are threats to reputations. The recipient might be seen as oversensitive. The source might be seen as racist or sexist or whatever it is. And the bystander might be seen as a coward. So can you do this in a way that allows everybody to rebuild their reputations and to restore and repair relationships? So any questions on this model before we get to the example? Just go ahead and unmute, or I can't see all the hands anymore now that I'm sharing my screen. So just go ahead and unmute. And I'm looking at the chat here. Okay, all right, so no questions, I'll move on then. So here's an example. Rachel and Janet are preparing the temple for services when a Latino man named Miguel, who they had never seen before, walks in and begins to look for a seat. Rachel greets the man and, wishing to be hospitable, gives him a prayer book and explains that Jewish books are read from right to left. You can see where this example came from, Rabbi Soifer. What are the microaggressions here? This is where it gets interactive. So please unmute and just shout out.
Assumption that he doesn't know.
Assumption that he's probably not Jewish, right? And that he doesn't know. And what message does that assumption give?
Doesn't welcome him.
That they're not welcome. Yeah. So if you were in the presence of this and you wanted to use the ARISE model, how might you say something to Rachel?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say it to her in front of anyone else.
Okay.
And
So what might you do then?
I might start being who I am with a question as to whether she understood that she was assuming something that might not be correct, and might.
So you might come at it with curiosity.
Yes.
Curiosity and questions.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Carol. Thank you for sharing that. Barbara?
I might introduce myself to Miguel, sit down and introduce myself and say, I haven't seen you before. My name is Barbara. Nice to meet you. Although I probably in reality wouldn't, because I'm very introverted, but that might be the right thing to do.
So what I love is that Carol talked about addressing it with Rachel. And then Barbara talked about addressing it with Miguel. And I think both of those are really important. It's important not only to address it with the source, but also to talk with the recipient and ask them, how did this make you feel? Like, are you doing okay? You know, I noticed that this happened, and I'm worried that it gave you this message, and that's not what we're about here in this congregation, and you're welcome here, right? Was there, sorry, I'm having trouble. Rabbi Soifer, if you could help me with the chat, because I can't see it when I'm sharing my screen.
Yeah, there's Geralda made a comment that responding as a bystander in front of the recipient might make them feel welcome. So actually, while the thing was going on, I might walk up and say, you know, hi, Miguel, I'm the rabbi. Glad you're here.
Thank you so much, Geralda, for bringing up this comment. Let's talk a little bit, because there's definitely pros and cons of doing it in the moment in front of everybody versus maybe pulling the person aside later and talking with them later. So, you know, the chances of pulling somebody aside, not kind of embarrassing them or not making them defensive, sometimes that can be really helpful to do it later. but then the person who is the recipient, Miguel in this case, doesn't know that that happened and may continue to feel unwelcome, or may get the message that this type of behavior is acceptable or is the norm in this situation. And so there's definitely pros and cons that are very situation specific. And I think you have to really kind of weigh out, what is the personalities of the different people here? What is my relationship with them? Am I close enough that I can get away with saying something in the moment? Am I an introvert? Am I an extrovert? You have to kind of weigh out all of those things. And what you can do, what I typically like to do, is kind of a little bit of both. There's this kind of shortcut approach in these situations called the oops and the ouch approach. So sometimes when you are an active bystander, one of the main things you want to do is just actively interrupt the microaggression. And so even just saying something like ouch, or if you're the source, saying something like oops, acknowledges to everybody right there and then that something bad happened, something that wasn't intended or consistent with the values of the group that you're in that moment, but maybe buys you a little bit of time to kind of think through how to respond. Because oftentimes when these things happen, even a bystander can be so shocked, they may not know what to do or say in that moment. And certainly recipients are dealing with the emotions of it. And so even just saying ouch or oops can interrupt the microaggression, but can buy you a little bit of time to then pull that person aside later, okay? So thank you for bringing that up, Geralda. Any other thoughts, comments here? The other thing you can do, if you feel comfortable, is to say either, in the moment or later, to kind of pull Rachel aside and say, hey, Rachel, I noticed when you greeted Miguel, I know you really well, and I know you to be a very welcoming person, and I'm assuming that you were trying to be kind and welcoming. But what I worry is that the way that you assumed that he wasn't Jewish message. And I bring this to your attention because I know how you feel about wanting to make people feel welcome and social justice and equality and equity. And so I'm bringing this to your attention because I wouldn't want you to continue to make this mistake, right? And so what we're kind of responding in a way that we are again, calling them in and trying to be empathic, but also trying to educate and hopefully making the person not very defensive and allowing them to learn from the situation. Any thoughts or comments on that before we move on?
Yeah, I wonder, Nicole, if let's say what you just said happened, and it happened, 15 minutes later, does Rachel go to Miguel and apologize at that point? Is that a good thing or a bad thing?
What do you think? What are your feelings on it?
I don't know. In some way, I mean, it feels to me like both are possible, right?
Yeah.
I mean, in a way, it's the right thing to do it, and then in some other ways, I don't know if it makes it worse.
Oh, so you think it might make it worse? I think the way that you would address it later would be what would matter in this situation. I think if you waited 15 minutes and then tried to apologize while being very defensive, I think that could probably make it worse. But I would imagine that it would feel very validating for Miguel to have Rachel come to him, even if it's a day later or something like that, and say, hey, I was reflecting on what I assumed, and I was trying to be welcoming, but I can absolutely appreciate that it came off as giving you the message that you don't belong here. And I am so sorry for that. And that is absolutely not the message that we want to give here. And I'm so glad that you were there. And, how did it hit you? And let's talk about this, right? I see Jen raised their hand. Yeah, Jen.
Hi. So I'm having a little bit of issues with it because now we're automatically thinking that Miguel is Jewish. So I think we need to meet a stranger with curiosity.
Okay.
Either assuming that they're Jewish or non-Jewish, and just greet them kindly and wish them Shabbat Shalom. And then if they're fumbling maybe with the prayer book, then it would be advisable to ask if we can be of any assistance.
So I love what you're saying is to not make any assumptions one way or the other, right?
That's correct. Yeah, meet
Yeah.
everyone with curiosity and welcoming.
Yeah. And I think that the issue with microaggressions is that I'm guessing for Miguel in this situation, this wasn't the first time that this has happened, right? And so I think that's kind of, it brings with it all the history of all the previous times. So yeah, I love your idea of not assuming anything about anybody, but the microaggression comes from assuming that all Jews look a particular way, and the way he looks is not consistent with that. Okay, I've got more to this. There's a part 2 in the few minutes that we have left here. So after services, a group is discussing the Black Lives Matter protest that was in town last weekend. Rachel asks Miguel, the only Latino in the room, what do your people think of this? Miguel is surprised at the question and looks around the room to find that some of the others are also looking uncomfortable, but they don't say anything. And Janet changes the topic and moves on to discuss the next service. All right, so what's the microaggression here?
She's assuming.
Yeah.
Jackie, can you finish that thought?
Yeah, she's assuming that he's a representative for his ethnicity instead of an individual with his own opinion.
Right. Generally, your people is probably something that you should avoid. You don't, it's this assumption that all people from one race are the same, or that one person who happens to be in the room can be the spokesperson for that entire group of people. And of course that, there's so much heterogeneity and everybody has their own opinion. So in this case, if you were one of these congregants that just sort of heard this, what might you do or say in the moment?
I might say something like, Rachel, I don't think it's fair that you asked Miguel to speak on behalf of all of his people, but I am interested, Miguel, in what do you think about this?
Mm-hmm. I love that, Jay. That is great. So you've interrupted it and you've invited his response as an individual. Yeah.
I think I would say something like, wow, Rachel, I'd love to hear what Miguel thinks too, but I sure wouldn't want to have to speak for all Jews.
I love how you phrased that. That would be great. So let's say somebody says something like this to Rachel. How can Rachel use the assist model to guide her response? I'm gonna show you what the assist model is. There it is.
She
How would
can
you-
acknowledge.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
She can acknowledge her bias and apologize.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like you're right. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. I'm very sorry. Thank you. I am not going to do that again.
It's a good oops moment.
Yeah, a good oops moment. And let's say nobody says anything, but let's say Miguel wants to respond. How can Miguel use the action approach in this situation?
Maybe he can ask, what does she mean exactly by which group that she's asking that he's representing?
Like, what do you mean by your people? And are you asking me to speak on behalf of all those people? Thank you. What else? Sometimes just that question stops it right there.
This is Barbara, other Barbara. Can you hear me?
Yes, hi, Barbara.
If I were Miguel, I think I'd be a little kinder and say, well, I will respond for myself. And this has been my experience. And if he wants to add, I can't speak for everyone else, but to be kind to Rachel, who's done some pretty dumb things, he could just handle it without bringing her into the conversation again.
Yeah, so he could just say, I'm speaking from my experience.
I have a question. With
Yes.
the same names. Are these two events that are concurrent? I mean, has he now been here several times at the temple?
I meant it just to be later.
This sometimes later down the road. Okay.
After services. So the first one was as Miguel was walking in, and this is now after services.
After services, I should have seen that.
That's okay, no worries.
I'm having difficulty believing that anybody would say that immediately after services, having just witnessed or experienced or been involved in the first event.
I see this a lot, and I've been the person who's been asked to speak on behalf of, whatever, my people. This happens in the classroom by well-intended professors all the time. And it's meant to try to reach out and engage and acknowledge that person. But then these poor people get put in the position of having to speak, and they're singled out because of their identity and having to speak on behalf of everyone, and it's kind of lumping everyone in the same pool. I mean, the Latinx culture is so incredibly diverse, and there's so many subcultures within that lump term, and so that's invalidating right there. So
yes, I haven't been a bystander to such an event yet.
Well, hopefully you will notice these more now. So I see that we're running short on time. That's kind of all that I had in terms of the presentation. And I know we're running short on time. So if anyone has to leave, I will not be offended, but I can stick around if anyone has questions, or if there's anything in the chat that I have not yet seen.
Dr. Jacobs, thank you so much. We actually have time for questions, up to another half hour.
Okay.
If you don't want to stay, if you're available. Again, if you want to comment, you can unmute yourself. But before you do that, go to the bottom of your Zoom screen where it says reactions. Hit that right now. See where it says raise hand, hit raise hand. After you say, when you do raise hand, a little hand will come up, which it is next to my face on my screen. At the end, then you go back to the reactions and it'll say lower hand. So you lower hand and get that off so that Rabbi Myra won't be thinking you have another question.
Or your hand won't get tired.
Or your hand won't get tired. I have a question.
Sure,
for Dr. Jacobs. How did you get interested in, or why did you choose this as your area for academic and kind of professional focus?
That's a good question. When I was, I don't know, 8, 9 years old, something like that, we had just come to this country from Iran, and there was the hostage crisis that was taking place at that time. And I experienced a lot of not necessarily microaggressions, but very explicit bias, people telling me to go home, just a lot of negativity. And I think that made me feel, just kind of appreciate and understand what it's like to be different, and how silly it is to treat people differently. And so over time, I just developed more interest in this area of diversity. And when I went to graduate school, there was a class that I got to take, and I learned about all of the history of oppression with Native Americans, and really just the stuff that you don't learn in your history books as you're going through school. And just dove in and learned as much as I could. And my hope is that as somebody who is white and doing this work in this space, that I can hopefully role model how to be an ally, that you can appreciate. I don't pretend to understand the experience of all people of color for sure, but I try to use my own experience, kind of like that Torah quote that we talked about earlier, is that, you know, knowing what it's like to be treated differently based on an aspect of my identity, and trying to use that as a means of having empathy and really learning how to be an ally for other groups.
I want to acknowledge Deborah's comment in the chat, where she said it would be fun to think about how we could make our temple environment welcoming. I would go further than fun. I mean, I think it's absolutely crucial, and that's a piece of what this is about for sure. So thank you for lifting that up, Deb.
That's a great discussion. So other than—
I could say something.
Please.
Yeah, I agree with you, Myra. I think it's really important. And I think it's going to be increasingly important as Reno becomes more and more diverse. And at the same time, I think also it would be fun to think about introducing maybe some more Ladino music, which is Judeo-Spanish music, and maybe having some events where we look at some of the great new research that's being done in Jewish studies on North African Jewish studies and North African Jewish music and that kind of thing. So I think I agree that it has a moral purpose, but I think it also could be really stimulating and bring a lot of people together. Not that I think we are aggressively non-welcoming, but just that we could start rethinking a few things.
And in light of last week's presentation, marking some of those Jewish events that are not Ashkenazic Jewish alone, that I think Sean, or I don't remember if Jason or Sean talked about. There's lots of things, and that would be great fun. Learn about, have more holidays.
We could have a whole couple of years of exploring diverse Judaisms. We're right next to San Francisco, where there's a great Jewish diversity organization, Nicole Jacobs. We could invite speakers, or we could do all kinds of things.
Those are great ideas, and those are great follow-up conversations, hopefully, for you all to have.
That's where we hope this will go.
One thing that I ask our medical students when I give this talk to them is I ask them, you know, imagine through the lens of the patient as they go through the whole experience. What is it like for them? And are you giving a welcoming environment, right? So from the minute they, you know, look you up online, to booking an appointment, to pulling up in the parking lot, to walking in the waiting room, you know, what do they see? What do they hear? How are they greeted? Is that welcoming to them, right? And remember that sometimes it's not even what people say or do, but it's the environment themselves. So like the music, you know, that's an environmental thing. Pictures of people on the walls or in newsletters, being inclusive, maybe even accessibility, right? Language, things like that.
Ina mentioned that Passover is a perfect opportunity to learn about the diversity of foods. I mean, that's a neat place to start, even with just the different kinds of charoset. I mean, it isn't all made the way, you know, that Ashkenazic Jews make it with apples and that stuff. If you look at Sephardic charoset, you know, may have raisins, it may have other things in it, whatever. So that's a neat idea.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a neat place to start.
Food is always a fun way to explore diversity and to validate that there are other ways, right? Carol? Can you unmute, please? Carol, we can't hear you. Can you unmute, please? There you go.
I'm going to sound a little defensive, but frankly, I think Sinai does a pretty good job of a lot of that right now. We have Sephardic music very often in our services. A number of our melodies have changed to include Sephardic music. When we do Passover, we generally have multiple food items that are not strictly Ashkenazic. And I'm not saying we can't do more, but I am going to say that I think we have started on the road. We happen to have a rabbi who speaks Spanish, and well, both of them speak it and pronounce Spanish names properly. And so I just wanted to put in a good word for what Temple Sinai is doing at this point. Are you laughing at me?
You're
Jeff?
right.
No, but well, I hope Jeff is not laughing at you. I will intervene. But sometimes it's interesting to hear from folks that we aren't doing quite as great a job as we might think we are. And I don't know for sure what we're going to hear next week, but it's worth listening to, for instance, our own members of color or others, because we do pride ourselves. And God knows that was, like, I thought, the hallmark of my rabbinate. But then it turns out sometimes we really do miss the mark. So, you know, I want to stay attuned to that. And Jay,
I think the thing with this issue, sorry, is that you can be doing a good job and there is always more that you can do. There's always more that you can learn. There's always things. Again, these implicit biases, these are our blind spots. These are spots that we don't even know we have. And I think next week you'll hear from a couple of folks within the temple who will share those experiences. And so I think this lifelong learning kind of stance is a space that I hope you all take on with this, because even as you could see from the way I started, you're never done. There's always more that you can learn. Even if you're an expert and your job is around this, there's still much more to learn all the time. Go ahead. I see Linda with a hand up.
I just wanted to note that the committee chair, Jay Goldberg, posted that he would encourage Sinai members to join the membership committee, because that's often the first contact people have with Temple Sinai. So a more diverse committee would also say something about our commitment and welcoming and so forth. Good plug, Jay, and good thought. And who did you see, Nicole?
Yeah, it was definitely Amy who's plugged, because she's technically on the membership.
Even better. My mistake, Amy.
That's okay.
Thank you. Oops.
That is a good call. Linda?
Yeah, my thought is here that, you know, sometimes I think we need to step back and kind of ask the question, what does welcoming look like? Because as we are so diverse in many, many different arenas, from our own perspectives, welcoming may look different to each of us. So when we try to be more welcoming, it might be helpful to kind of try to inquire as to what that really means for us.
And I think also thinking about what people want, right? So I might think I might want a certain way to be welcomed, but people from other cultures may
not
be welcomed in different ways, right?
Exactly. So what does that really look like? And I think we need to listen to each other and kind of explore that a bit.
That's a great point.
Thanks. So anybody else? Nicole, that was wonderful. Thank you so much for this presentation.
I really want to applaud all of you. These can be difficult things to talk about, and you all were so open and gracious. I think just the fact that you're talking about this is huge. So thank you for allowing me to be part of this conversation. And I wish you all the very best.
Nicole, I had one more question.
Sure.
If the operating principle, which is a principle I wholeheartedly endorse, is that nobody's meaning to be nasty or excluding or racist or biased or whatever. I presume that if you find yourself in a place with someone who actually does seem to mean to be being that, and they say so, or they've done it so consistently or whatever, does that flip it from a microaggression to something macro at that point, or?
Yeah, so microaggressions often come from implicit bias, which is bias that we don't even know we have. But that explicit, which again, we've seen a lot more of, and how do you respond to that? And that is very situation specific. I think you potentially could kind of come at it again from a humanitarian perspective with the kindness and the empathy and see where that gets you. But that could also make things worse, or have you come off as you being naive or something like that. Sometimes in those situations, or even with microaggressions, when they are recurrent and people are not responding to feedback, in those situations, you may want to kind of take it a step higher. That oftentimes, if it's happening in some type of organization, I don't know if your congregation would have a committee to kind of bring this to their attention, to talk to them about it, not in a way that is like, you know, tattling, but like, hey, you know, I noticed that there's a behavior that's creating disunity in our community, and how can we respond to this? So sometimes kind of escalating it to a higher level, or if this is happening to you at work, right? There's Title IX offices, there's EEO offices. So sometimes if it's very egregious, or if it's just consistent, you know, it's a microaggression that just won't stop, escalating it, if it's that explicit, can be helpful. Is that you, Geralda? And then Jeff with hands up?
Yes, hi. Yeah, I was just thinking about the when you made the comment when Myra about it happening, continuing to happen over and over, which is something that I've experienced. And at some point, and I guess that's why I kind of cringed at some of the suggestions that you had for the recipient, because, you know, that's one of the things that I have seen. It's like, what do you do? How, you know, why is it my responsibility to be the nice person, to think about, you know, to be that person if something continues to happen over and over again? At some point, I have to say, enough is enough. I am sick and tired of this.
Yes.
And it's like, why am I supposed to be the nice person, the sweet, the kind, the considerate one all the time?
Yeah,
You know,
it's exhausting.
and that's what I really, I really have been sitting here listening to all of this, and I am cringing because I am tired. I am 66 years old. I am tired of this. And at some point, you know, enough is enough. And I have said for the longest time, actually over the last year, when so many people contact me, especially in this past year since George Floyd's murder, you know, people have contacted me wanting to be the token spokesperson or whatever. But I'm like saying, no. It's on you now. That's why I would like to have seen more responsibility placed on the others and not on me. I'm tired of it. You know, it's not my responsibility anymore to tell you guys what to do, how to think, and to stop acting and doing the same thing over and over and over again. So I think I better shut up now, but that's it.
I think it took a lot of courage for you to say that. And I'm really glad that you did. It is not your responsibility, and it's exhausting. And that is why this bystander piece is really important, because how many other people have been in the presence of these comments, right? Let's share the burden, right? Let's educate ourselves rather than expecting, you know, the people of color in our lives to, you know, all of us have Google machines. All of us can go and read. There's so many, you know, again, in the last year with the racial reckoning that's been happening, almost every organization has sort of references and resources and videos and books. And, you know, there's so many wonderful ways for us to educate ourselves and not burden the people in our lives to do that, because they're tired. They've been doing this all their lives, and this past year with I can imagine, Geralda, people calling and checking and, you know, asking, probably well-intended, right? But it's exhausting. Yeah.
All right, I see Jeff's hands up. Do you want to bring us home, Jeffrey?
Yeah, to bring this back in a Jewish circle way, there's sort of a famous line in Leviticus: "You shall not hate your kinsman in your heart, but reprove your neighbor, incur no guilt. In the view of the rabbis, the duty to reprove one's neighbor has two applications. The first is to confront the fellow with personal grievances, to bring things up. You're obliged, you're encouraged to do so. And the idea is that the hope of this is to bring about their regeneration. And that is sort of, it's a Jewish obligation to, when someone has either insulted you or you're the bystander, or you're the person who committed this, you know, there's an obligation to deal with that and to try to improve what happened. A couple things at the end of next session or following the last session, we're going to send out a questionnaire asking for your suggestions from everybody going forward about programs they'd like to have or hear in this direction. Also, we're probably going to go ahead and put together a committee going forward. And so think about how many of you want to be on the committee. There won't be any snack served because it'll be online. So most
Maybe
Jewish committees have great food. That's the reason.
Maybe soon, maybe someday soon.
Maybe someday soon. We'll see about that. And Myra, would you like to comment a bit on next week's program again?
Well, next week we will hear from two folks who are online right now, and I'm not going to say anything because I don't know what they're going to say. So Geralda Miller and Talia Guzman will talk to us about their identities as Jews of color and what we might want to know about that experience, and particularly in the context of Temple Sinai. At least I think that's what they're doing. I'm going to call you both after this is done just to check in.
I'd like to point out we have 50 screens active today. So that's that's even better than last week. So thank you all for participating. Thank you especially to Dr. Jacobs for putting on, kind of making us all think. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Unmute and say thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you so much.
Thank you.
Really
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone. See you in a few weeks, hopefully.
1 week.
1 week.
No, a month, April, end of April.
Oh.